Emerging Virus Threats Advisory Group, or NERVTAG, and he is himself a clinical immunologist who's been leading Europe's biggest study of people in hospital with COVID-19. He's also advised the government's Key Sage Committee, and earlier this morning I asked him if the government is making the right decision to ease the lockdown now.
I think I share with all my scientific colleagues, or virtually all my scientific colleagues, a deep concern that we need to go with great caution. At the moment, we still have quite a large number of cases out there in the community. And I think unlocking too fast carries a great risk that all the good work that's been put in by everyone to try to reduce transmission may be lost. So we do need to proceed with great care at this point.
Do you think the government is going too fast?
Well, I think there is a pretty unanimous message now that we need to take this slowly and go step by step, and we need to evaluate the effect of each step before we move to the next one. I don't hear any great dissent amongst the advisors who are speaking in public at the moment.
Your colleague Patrick Vallance is writing in the papers today saying that you have to balance the science against, for instance, the economics and the damage to the economy and job losses and all of that. You'd concur with that?
Well, I understand that argument. I mean, having grown up and worked all my life in health, obviously my perspective, it comes from the health perspective. And as a doctor, it seems to me that health takes the ultimate, is the ultimate decider. But I can absolutely understand that others have taken into account a broader view. But to me, health is the ultimate priority.
Can I ask you about test and trace and whether it is actually possible for this to work, given the number of infections the ONS tells us? We're seeing 8,000 or so in the community, never mind hospitals and care homes. Is it possible for us to test and trace effectively with that level of infectivity?
Well, I'm not an expert in testing and tracing, but to me, we need the numbers to be much lower. And we need also to gear up the test and trace in order to be able to cope with many thousands of cases which are now being seen. I mean, having said that, the cases now tend to be in care homes and in other identified communities, but that doesn't mean to say that we don't need a massive gearing up of testing and tracing before it really is safe to remove restrictions to any large degree.
Can you clear up, for instance, your thinking about infectivity outside? Lots and lots of people are pouring out of their houses onto parks and beaches and so forth. How dangerous do you think that is?
Well, there have been some quite big surveys done now of where infectivity happens. There's been mapping of hundreds of outbreaks. Over 320 outbreaks were traced in one particular paper which came out from China, and they looked for where those transmissions were happening. And they could only find a single example where transmission appeared to have occurred in the wide open air. It was mostly domestic transmission within enclosed environments and some transmission on transport. But essentially, if you're sitting in the open air at a safe distance and not speaking close up to somebody, and particularly not shouting or singing loudly, then that seems to be very low risk.
What about surfaces? What about people who are leaving the post or a parcel untouched for a few days in case that's got COVID-19 on it?
Yes. Well, again, it's possible to detect the virus using this very, very sensitive PCR method, which looks for the virus genome. Whether that actually means that there's infectious virus there is quite a different matter. And I think there's great confusion, which is caused by, for example, equating detection of the viral RNA using this very sensitive PCR test with what people are terming virus shedding. I think that that's an inappropriate term because we know a lot of that which is detected is actually not infectious. It's very hard to measure the infectious virus, and I think we need, in part now, to be guided by known transmission events and what we're actually observing with COVID, particularly rather than inferring what transmission might occur by our knowledge of influenza.
So that leads me neatly to what's going to happen tomorrow, which is schools reopening.
Yes.
How dangerous do you think that is in terms of infectivity, and could it push the R number up?
Well, it could. I mean, it's a very contentious area. I mean, there have been descriptions of infections amongst school children. I mean, we know that children are basically exempt from severe disease, except for this very rare but extremely serious inflammatory condition, which has been likened to Kawasaki disease. There's been a lot of attention because it's a very devastating disease when it occurs, but it's extremely rare. And we know that less than 2% of the severe cases are in children under the age of 18. That doesn't mean to say necessarily that children can't catch it, because we know that many children have caught it and have antibody. But we don't know that they amplify the disease in the same way that they do with influenza. We knew that school transmission was a major driver of epidemics of influenza, and that's why school closures were so important in 2009 in the early stages. That really seemed to have a big effect. There's much less evidence that that's going to have a big effect here. And I think until we've got really well-documented amplification of outbreaks in schools, my personal feeling is that that cautious school openings might be justified.
If, and I say if, Britain is unlocking too early, and we don't know that, how quickly will we see the R number rising, and what can be done about it?
Unfortunately, there's really quite a lag between what's happening out there in the community and the epidemiological signals that are coming through. And typically, it takes 2 or 3 weeks before we start to see the effect. And it's going to be very patchy. It may be that actually easing lockdown is perfectly okay in areas like London, which were hit early and hit hard, and where the epidemic seems to have been virtually passed in many parts of the community, with a few exceptions. But up north, it's still a very large number of cases. So I think we need to be more subtle about the geography, and we need to look at the particular areas where it may be appropriate to ease lockdown. It's a difficult message to communicate, and clearly simple, clear communication has been a priority so far. But maybe there needs to be a bit more subtlety to the way in which lockdown is eased.
Now, the other thing that's about to happen is that 2 million people who have been shielded will be allowed out. Can I ask you, have we been shielding the right people?
That's a really important question. I mean, at the moment, the order to shield has been based on a presumption of sensitivity to coronavirus. But there are some huge studies coming out now. And I think with this new information, it may seem that many people who we thought might have been vulnerable, in fact, are not vulnerable. In particular, people, say, who have recovered from cancer 5 years previously, who may think that they are susceptible. But in fact, it looks quite clear that people who have recovered and are now well and not on any anti-cancer drugs are actually relatively safe. And the same for asthma, which we knew to be a major risk factor for influenza, but now seems not to be a risk factor unless you're on oral steroids. So a subset of asthmatics may be susceptible. But I think we're going to be able to fine-tune the advice now and actually reassure some people who we feared might be susceptible that, in fact, they're not as vulnerable as we thought. So that's really the good news.
You've been doing a big study of people with COVID-19 in hospital. What is that telling you about the longer-term effects of this disease?
I think what's alarming is that this is not a simple, straightforward lung infection. It's turning out that it affects all sorts of other organ systems. And indeed, many people who've apparently recovered then come back saying that things are not right. They have a diversity of long-term effects. And we're seeing in our follow-up clinics a very high proportion who really cannot get back to a normal life because of the delayed effects of this virus. I think the long-term study of the after effects of this virus are going to really reveal an awful lot about this disease that we just haven't yet imagined. And it's vitally important that we do have long-term follow-up.
Professor Openshaw, thanks very much